Now, when we think of abusive relationships, very strong images come to mind. There's a stereotype of what an abusive relationship looks like. And these patterns of behaviour can lead us to be stuck. And the patterns of behaviour are not only on the side of the abuser, but also on the side of the person being abused. And it's important to note that not all abuse victims will fit the stereotype of the weak victim. Some people won't take that image at all, and you need to watch this video to the very end. And we're often running an unconscious pattern in relationships, and abuse is another example of where that can be playing out. As I say, whether we're the person being abused or the one abusing, we're running a pattern which we may not be aware of from the inside, but others from the outside will be more aware of that. And what happens is that physical abuse isn't the only kind of abuse that we're looking at, but it is one of the most easily recognized, including by the law. It's actually against the law, obviously, to assault somebody. So where there's any physical contact which isn't agreed by the party, whether it's a hit, a slap, a push, pinning someone down, anything with a physical component is very easily recognizable. But the effects of other kind of abuse can also be similarly damaging, not only emotionally, but physically as well. So what other kind of abuse are there? And what are the signs of abuse in a relationship? What does it look like, whether you're in the relationship or looking at a relationship from the outside, that would actually define an abusive relationship? And how we normally think about that is anything where we're treating a partner, or we're being treated with anything that looks like cruelty or violence, really the imposing of harm on our partner or on another human being for that matter. And note that that definition about treating with cruelty or violence doesn't specify that it's necessarily only about physical abuse. There are other kinds of abuse as well which would fit that definition, where cruelty and violence are on display, but there's no physical manifestation of that. And so abuse should never be tolerated. That not only in relationships, but clearly if it's a loving relationship, then it doesn't have any place in then cruelty doesn't have any place in that loving relationship. And it's important to know that cruelty and harm can be inflicted without any physical contact. So you might have a physical symptom from being hit or being slapped by somebody, but it's really important to recognize that emotional abuse also, because of the way the chemicals work in our body, the fight or flight reaction, the stress reaction in our body, that we also have a physical effect of emotional and other kind of abuse that we're going to be looking at. So abuse can also show up as bullying and has a feeling of not caring. And it goes without saying that this has no place in a loving relationship. And emotional abuse is very common in relationships, and we know that our partners well, and because we know them well, we understand their vulnerability, so it makes it particularly easy in some cases for our partners to abuse us, because they really know our sensitivities in certain areas. And physical abuse is the first kind of abuse that we're going to talk about, and this is where our physical well-being is compromised, and you'll recognize this by having been hit or slapped or pushed, some kind of physical contact. And the thing to remember is, if it can happen once, then it can happen again. And these patterns generally get quite well embedded in relationships. And violence can be perpetuated by women as well as by men. And even though the statistics clearly say that men tend to be the bigger group in terms of perpetuating this kind of violence, that it can also happen the other way around. And there's no shame in being subjected to abuse. So whether you're a woman or a man, that this is something that is being experienced right now, but there's absolutely no shame on you for having experienced that. That person would essentially potentially been behaving in that way towards someone else had it not been you. So this time it's been you, but it could also have been someone else. At the same time, in future, it could be somebody else. So that abusive person will tend to have that pattern, and they'll be running it until they decide to address that, if and when that ever happens. But this time it's you, so obviously this is the purpose of the video, and this is why it's so important that we own this and really look to deal with it, because emotional abuse is the second kind of abuse, and this is where we see things like manipulation, bullying, cruelty, and making fun of the other person in the relationship. And abuse, as we said, whatever the kind of abuse, should never be tolerated and has no place in a loving relationship or any other kind of relationship. And sometimes you need support in taking action to address this, where you haven't got the resources right now to do that. And financial abuse is also quite common, where, for example, a partner could be overly controlling of spend. Maybe you have an allowance, but then you're not allowed to spend it in a certain way, or maybe your partner's using your money without your permission, almost a form of stealing or taking something that isn't theirs. We also find times where blackmail, where somebody is controlling you by spending money and then expecting something in return, some kind of favor or something back in return. And as we said, abuse should never be tolerated, whatever the kind of abuse that we're looking at. And sometimes you need support in taking action, recognizing and owning that. And anything really where you're being deliberately harmed by your partner is abuse. And even where it can be negligence, where there's an extreme sense of negligence, where even where it's not deliberate, it could still come under the definition of abuse because it has a sense of not caring, that not caring quality. And we're offering a free coaching call to anyone who suspects that they might be suffering from any kind of abuse or bad behavior, or even if you suspect that you may be abusing your partner and you want to understand that and get clarity. Support is available for those seeking help, and we'll enable you to get that clarity. And if we feel that we can help you further through that, we'll explain how that process would work. And remember, you're always only one decision away from a completely different life.